St. Paul's chapter 13. All right, what is happening here? First, no chapter is more problematic in Mark. The secondary literature, the commentaries and the articles that have been written on this chapter is just monumental. This is also the longest uninterrupted discourse of Jesus in Mark. So like in Matthew, you have the Sermon on the Mount, which is extremely long. In Mark, this is the longest time Jesus is speaking uninterruptedly. Also, this is now the bridge between ministry and his passion on the cross. This is the main event. Chapter 13 is the main thing that happens in between the ministry he had in Israel and the passion which is confronting him. So before we start doing end time stuff or prophecy or predicting the future, any of that stuff, we need to keep in mind that his own death is close. That's what's on the forefront of his mind, that his own passion is before him. It's what's on the horizon, the near horizon. That we have to keep in mind before we do any sort of prophetic, visionary stuff at all. Because what he's seeing is destruction is coming. But the question we now ask, since we have a full Mark context, is whose? Is it Jerusalem? Is it Jesus? Is it both? So he predicts the downfall of the temple, that is the sanctuary of God, these beautiful stones. And Jesus says, well, not one will be left upon the other. Again, is it Jerusalem? Well, yes. Is it Jesus? Oh, yeah, it might be. Is it both? They proceed then to go up to the Mount of Olives, which we had already seen was a few chapters before, a symbol too of the end times when God was going to tear up that mountain and establish a new one. So here they are again talking about the end times. First thing we're going to do here, when people start talking about the end times, Jesus warns us, and we don't take the warning, do not get all divine conspiracy. That is, what's God doing? Is this the end of the time? Maybe these are the signs. Maybe things are aligning. Jesus says, see that no one leads you astray. Do not be alarmed. Be on your guard. Do not get all divine conspiracy. Instead, do your job of witnessing. Jesus says these things are going to happen. Don't worry about them. Stop there right now. Do not be alarmed. Be on your guard. Instead, what your job is when these things start happening is you are to speak. You are to live for Jesus, and you are to die for Jesus. The Holy Spirit will help you to talk about Jesus, and the Holy Spirit will help you to endure till the end. For the one who endures to the end will be saved. That's your job. Living and dying for Jesus. Not trying to figure out, are these the stars that God is aligning, and now this is the end of time? Don't do that. That's not your job. The abomination of desolation. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not to be, let the reader understand. Little parenthetical comment here. What does this mean? Let's see. That those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Really difficult verse. Couple ideas. Caligula in AD 40 put a picture of himself in the temple. Well, that could be an abomination of desolation. This phrase taken out of, this idea taken out of Daniel, was that the temple would become so desolated, would become so ruined by somebody desecrating it, that it would no longer be fit for worship, and God's glory would leave the temple. It would be so desecrated that it would be no longer fit for worship. Well, Caligula, Emperor Caligula, put an image of himself there. Later on in 66, 67, there were rebels that had taken hold of the temple, and they were doing all sorts of horrible things in it, criminal things, murder. They had set up some goofball priest as a mockery to the whole sacrificial system. And of course, the temple itself is destroyed in AD 70. Mark says, let the reader understand. When would it be that the temple of God was most horribly desecrated? Well, first let's ask, what is the true temple of God? It's Jesus. So when would the abomination of desolation standing where it not ought to be? Let the reader understand. Mark is hinting, is it the temple? Yes, it is the temple. The temple will be destroyed. But let the reader understand something else is going on here. The abomination of desolation is not just Jerusalem. It's Jesus. And when that happens, when the death of Christ happens, in a sense, like all hell is going to break loose. Now, what we're seeing here is things are getting mixed up. They're swirling together. We've got the death of Jesus and Jerusalem and end times all swirling together. And so when it comes out, we can't really pull the pieces apart. It kind of looks like Jesus. It kind of looks like the destruction of the temple. It kind of looks like the end of time. So what is it? That's part of the problem of this chapter. What I'm saying is I think it's everything. Again, though, but be on your guard. I have told you all things beforehand. Second time he says, be on your guard. Coming of the Son of Man. This section here is thick with Old Testament allusions, especially again, Daniel 7. And it seems like it's the end of the world and the beginning of God's kingdom. Tribulation, sun darkened, moon not giving its light, and then the coming of the Son of Man with great power and great glory. All right. When did these things happen? Well, when was the sun darkened and there was an earthquake at Jesus' death? And when did he come again in glory? At his resurrection. But this also sounds like the end of time, right? The end of time, the powers will be shaken, and God himself in Jesus Christ will come back to establish a new order. So maybe it's not just one. Maybe it's not just the end. Maybe it's also the cross. The lesson of the fig tree. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. We stumble over this because we haven't fit into our mind that it's not just one thing that Jesus is talking about. He's not just talking about the end. He's talking about what's right in front of him, the cross, which is all this stuff. The cross is the end. It's the desolation. It's the destruction of the temple. And it's also more than that. All these things take place. Everything is going to happen soon, and yet not soon. Again, be on your guard. Keep awake. Third time. Stay awake. Stay awake. He repeatedly says throughout this chapter, no one lead you astray. Do not be alarmed. Be on your guard. Be on your guard. Stay awake. Stay awake. We read a chapter like this and our minds immediately drift off into when's this going to happen and who's going to do it. Those are the very same questions the disciples ask. Jesus doesn't answer them. Instead, he tells you to do something else. Stay awake. Be on your guard. Witness to Jesus. Okay, so here's my interpretation of what's going on in this chapter. You take it or leave it for what you want. My opinion of this chapter. Here's how Jesus, God, and here's how I think time works. The cross is actually at the center of time. We think the cross is behind us. I don't think that's how God views time. I think he sees the cross as the center of time, and there's things that come before it and things that come after it. But all of time then is shaped. It looks like this. There's always death and resurrection because this is the form that time takes. The beginning was not the beginning. The beginning of creation, right? Genesis. The end is not the end. Revelation. This is the beginning, and this is the end. From here, things radiate out both ways. Genesis is not the beginning. Revelation is not the end. This is the beginning and end. So time itself takes the shape of Jesus' life and death. Think of it like an earthquake. Before and after, feel the aftershock of the cross. So everything, all of time ends up looking like this. This is why the Exodus looks like the Exodus. The Exodus, the Israelites in Egypt looks like a death and resurrection. Well, of course, because this was the center of time, and the Exodus reverberated out of that. This is why the temple looks like the death and resurrection, because the cross is at the center of the time, and things reverberate out of that. This is why even coronavirus looks a bit like the end of time. Well, right, because all of time takes the shape of the cross. All of time ends up looking somehow like Jesus. But it's important to keep in mind that this has to be central. Everything else moves out from here. Now then, we've crossed this bridge, and the cross is really at the center. We move towards the thing itself. Chapter 14, and into the Passion.